The year was 1944, and the field outside Ciudad Obregón, Sonora, Mexico, was not impressive. It was a thin, sorry-looking plot. Half the plants already toppled from stem rust, the rest pale and spindly in the October heat. 60 men from the Rockefeller Foundation's agricultural mission had gathered that morning, most of them in pressed shirts and leather shoes, standing well back from the dust. Dr. Elvin Stackman, 58, chief plant pathologist and the most decorated cereal scientist in North America, looked out at the ruined crop and then looked at the young man who had planted it. He pulled a cigarette from his breast pocket, lit it, and said it plainly, "Norman, if you keep chasing this idea, you will waste the best years of your career on a dead end. These wheats cannot do what you think they can do. The soil won't allow it. The climate won't allow it. And frankly, neither will the literature." The other men laughed. A few nodded. One of them, Richard Bradfield, 49, a Cornell agronomist who had built his entire reputation on soil science, turned to his colleague and said just loud enough, "The boy's in love with a weed." Norman Ernest Borlaug, 30 years old from Cresco, Iowa, said nothing. He crouched down, took a handful of soil in his fist, held it for a moment, then let it fall. He stood up, walked back to the seed trays, and kept working. He had already paid for the season's supplies out of his own pocket. March 18, 1968, New Delhi, India. A convoy of 35 trucks moved through the city before dawn, each one carrying 250-kilogram sacks of wheat stacked floor to ceiling. The Indian government had quietly moved 18,000 tons of seed. All of it descended from a single experimental cross made in a broken-down greenhouse in Mexico into warehouses across Punjab and Haryana. By the end of that crop year, India would harvest 17 million metric tons of wheat. It was more than the country had ever produced in its entire recorded history. Famine, which had been projected as a certainty by every major Western analyst as recently as 1965, did not come. But to understand how we got there, we have to go back to Sonora and to the one thing Norman Borlaug noticed in that dying field that nobody else did. Before we continue, hit subscribe if you enjoy stories that changed history forever. It was the stems. Every other scientist on that plot was looking at the grain heads, counting kernels, estimating yield, measuring rust damage. Borlaug was looking lower. He had a habit, one his father had drilled into him on the rye fields of Howard County, Iowa, of watching where a plant's weight sat. His father, Henry Borlaug, had died in 1942 with a notebook of hand-drawn plant diagrams, 30 years of observations about stalk strength and harvest loss in wet years. Norman had carried that notebook to Mexico rolled inside his shirt because it wouldn't fit in his luggage. What Borlaug saw in that Sonora field was that every high-yield wheat variety, every one the foundation had bet on, fell over under the weight of its own grain. The stem couldn't carry what the head produced. Rain bent it. Wind finished it. Farmers called it lodging, and they had accepted it as natural. The agronomists called it a soil problem, a climate problem, a drainage problem. Borlaug called it an engineering problem. He had been corresponding quietly, with no institutional backing, with a Japanese breeder named Gunjiro Inazuka about a short-strawed wheat called Norin 10. The variety had been bred in Awadi Prefecture in 1935, carried home in a soldier's kit bag after the war, and was sitting in a USTA cold storage facility in Pullman, Washington, largely ignored. It had stubby, thick stems. It could hold weight. The yield numbers were modest. No one had thought to cross it with a rust-resistant variety because the combination seemed too remote, too unlikely. Borlaug requested a small sample. He received 14 seeds. He planted those 14 seeds in a corner of the Sonora Experiment Station in November 1952 and told almost no one what he was doing or why. His wife, Margaret Gibson Borlaug, had joined him in Mexico that year after 7 years of living apart. She in Minneapolis, he in the field. She had agreed to come because he had promised the work was almost finished. That promise had been made, in varying forms, several times before. When she arrived and saw the condition of the station, a cracked concrete building, 2 broken irrigation pipes, a borrowed microscope, she sat down in the doorway and did not say anything for a long time. "How many more years?" she finally asked. "I don't know," he said. "Is this one going to matter?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think so." The crossing work was painstaking. Borlaug and his single assistant, a 22-year-old Mexican agriculturalist named Roberto Rodriguez, hand-emasculated wheat flowers with tweezers under a magnifying glass, transferring pollen grain by grain to prevent self-pollination. A single crossing took 40 minutes. A full experimental matrix required over 6,000 crossings per season. In 1953 and 1954, 2 consecutive seasons were nearly wiped out by an unexpected late-season rust strain that the Norin crosses had not yet inherited resistance to. Rodriguez came to him after the second loss. "Dr. Borlaug, I have been counting. We have used 4 years and approximately $11, zero Zune and foundation money on this cross, and we have 2 seasons of failure. I think Stackman is going to ask us to report on progress in the spring. I know, Borlaug said. What will you tell him? The truth, that I found something. He had. On a single plant in the corner of plot 17B, one of the Norin crosses had set grain. The stalk was 78 centimeters tall, nearly 40 centimeters shorter than any comparable Mexican wheat, and it was standing straight. Under full grain weight, in the wind, it was standing straight. He measured it 3 times. Then he covered it with a wire cage to protect it, and did not tell anyone else until the seed was safely harvested. The 1955 season was the first time outsiders noticed. A Rockefeller field inspector named George Harrar, 44 years old, cautious, meticulous, walked the Sonora plots in February and stopped at Borlaug's section. The short-strawed crosses had been scaled up to a half-acre trial. They were uniformly compact, deep green, upright, loaded with grain heads that should, by all previous logic, have pulled the plants flat. Harrar stood there for a full minute without speaking. Then he said, "What am I looking at?" "Wheat," Borlaug said. "It shouldn't stand up like that." "No," Borlaug agreed, "it shouldn't." Harrar wrote a 3-page internal memo that week. It was cautiously worded, anomalous performance in dwarf cross trials, but it found its way to Stackman's desk in Minneapolis. Stackman did not respond for 6 weeks. The financial pressure that year was severe. The foundation had begun asking hard questions about resource allocation, and Borlaug's shuttle breeding program, which moved seed back and forth between 2 growing seasons, one in Sonora and one in the Toluca Valley, was consuming twice its original budget. An internal review in October 1955 recommended consolidating to a single growing site. That would have cut the program's pace in half. Margaret found the review letter on the kitchen table. She read it, set it down, and did not raise it again that evening. But she moved the family's savings, $3,200 kept in a passbook account, to a joint account she'd been told they could draw on if the foundation funding was suspended. "I know what you're going to do if they cut you," she told him. "You'd let me?" he said. "I'd be angry," she said. "But yes." The review was shelved when the 1956 yield trials came back. Borlaug's best cross, a line he had designated as PIDIC 62, though it would not carry that name officially for several years, had yielded 6.2 metric tons per hectare under experimental conditions. The previous record for Mexican wheat was 2.8. He ran the numbers with Rodriguez twice, then sent them to Harrar without commentary. Harrar's reply was 3 words. "Confirm this immediately." They confirmed it across 4 replicated plots. The number held. Then came word from Pakistan. A famine early warning report, dated November 1958, had been quietly shared with the Foundation by the U.S. State Department. South Asia was moving toward a food deficit that all models suggested would be unmanageable by 1970. Its population was rising faster than yield. The window was closing. Borlaug pinned the report to the wall above his seed storage cabinet and left it there. The test came in 1965, and it very nearly ended everything. The Indian government had agreed, after years of negotiation, skepticism, and bureaucratic delay, to a large-scale import of Borlaug's semi-dwarf wheat seed. The order was for 250 metric tons, the largest single seed shipment in history to that point. It was to be planted across demonstration fields in Punjab before the 1965 Rabi season. On September 6, 1965, 2 weeks before the seed was scheduled to ship from Mexico, India and Pakistan went to war. Borlaug flew to Delhi anyway. The fields were there. The farmers were there. The seed was in the ship's hold, sitting in Guaymas Harbor. He spent 11 days working through Indian customs officials, USDA attachés, and State Department bureaucrats to keep the shipment moving. He was told on 3 separate occasions that the import license had been suspended. On 2 of those occasions, he went around the person who told him and found someone else. The seed arrived in late October, 6 weeks late. The optimal planting window had narrowed to almost nothing. And then there was the fertilizer. Borlaug's varieties had been developed to respond to nitrogen fertilizer. That was part of the design. High nitrogen made traditional tall wheats fall over, but the short-strawed crosses could absorb it and convert it directly into grain. Without adequate fertilizer, the seed would still outperform local varieties, but not dramatically. The demonstration plots needed to be dramatic. Yet the Indian government's fertilizer allocation for the Punjab demonstrations was less than a third of what was required. Borlaug stood in a field outside Ludhiana on a November afternoon in 1965 with Dr. M.S. Swaminathan, the Indian geneticist who had pushed hardest for the import program. The soil had been prepared. The seed had been planted. The fertilizer bags behind them contained perhaps enough for 60% of the field. "If this doesn't show," Swaminathan said, "they will not try again." "I know," Borlaug said. "The minister will withdraw the program." Borlaug looked out at the field. Then he looked at the fertilizer bags. He said, "Then we do the center plots at full rate and leave the edges light. Anyone who comes to look will walk to the middle first." Swaminathan paused. Then he nodded. By March 1966, the center plots outside Ludhiana had produced 4.6 metric tons per hectare. Indian officials, agricultural journalists, and two representatives of the Ford Foundation walked those rows in silence. The edge plots, running at 60% nitrogen, had produced 3.1 tons. The best local variety, in the adjacent comparison plot, had produced 1.1 tons. Nobody laughed. Nobody said a word for a long time. A senior Indian agricultural ministry official, a man who had publicly questioned the import program in Parliament the previous year, stood at the edge of the demonstration field and stared at the grain heads. He turned to Swaminathan and said quietly, "We need more seed, whatever it takes." Dr. Elvin Stackman came to Mexico one last time in the spring of 1969. He was 83 years old. His health was not good, and he had been told by his doctors in Minneapolis that travel was inadvisable, and he had ignored them. He wanted to see the fields. Borlaug met him at the Sonora experiment station, the same cracked concrete building, though it had been expanded twice by then. They walked the plots together for most of the morning without much conversation. Stackman moved slowly, but he looked carefully. He stopped often. He bent down as old plant men do and handled the stems. In the afternoon, they sat in the station's small office. Stackman was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I told you that you were chasing a dead end." "You did," Borlaug said. "I was wrong." Stackman looked out the window at the rows of wheat. "Not about the science as it stood then. I was right about the science as it stood then, but I was wrong about you. I underestimated what you were willing to do to find out." Borlaug didn't answer. "How many countries?" Stackman asked. 31, Borlaug said. "By the end of this year, probably 35. And the yield, on average? Average farmer in Punjab is running about 4.5 tons per hectare. They were at 1.1 inches 1,964. Stackman put his hands on the desk. "A billion people, Norman. That's the number they are using now. A billion people who might have starved." "Might have," Borlaug said. "Don't be modest about that." Borlaug picked up the cup of coffee on his desk, plain, black, as it always was, and held it for a moment. On the wall behind him, slightly crooked as it had always been, was Henry Borlaug's notebook. His father's handwriting on the cover, 30 years of watching stalks. "My father thought the stalk was the problem," Borlaug said. "He never thought to change it. I just finished what he was looking at." By the time the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to Norman Borlaug in October 1970, his semi-dwarf wheat varieties had been adopted across 40 million hectares of farmland. India had moved from a net grain importer to a net exporter in 5 years. Pakistan's wheat production had doubled. Estimates published by the Food and Agriculture Organization placed the number of famine deaths prevented by the Green Revolution's first decade at somewhere between 500 million and 1 billion people. The precise number was, and remains, impossible to calculate exactly. But no serious researcher disputes the order of magnitude. It had begun with 14 seeds. There is a version of this story that gets told at universities and in policy papers. And in that version, it is a story about science, about genetics and nitrogen, and high-yield agriculture, and the march of human progress. But the version that matters started with a man who watched where the weight sat on a dying plant in a broken field in Mexico, after everyone with credentials had already walked away. Attention is not glamorous. It does not look like anything from the outside. Norman Borlaug spent 11 years running seeds back and forth between two mountain valleys in Mexico before anyone called it a breakthrough. He measured stems in the dark. He wrote letters to scientists whose ideas nobody wanted. He protected one plant under a wire cage and did not tell anyone what he was hoping for. That is what legacy looks like before it becomes legacy. That is what it looks like when someone decides that a thing other people consider finished is, in fact, only just beginning. His father had been watching the same problem on a farm in Iowa. Borlaug just had more seasons to work with. There are still problems like that, sitting in notebooks, waiting for someone who is willing to keep looking when the crowd has moved on. The only question is who's still paying attention. If something in this story stayed with you, if you found yourself thinking about what has been overlooked in your own field, or your own work, or your own inheritance, this channel exists for exactly that reason. Every episode we make is a search for the moment before the breakthrough, when the person who saw it clearly had nothing but patience and a question nobody else was asking. The past cannot be changed, but the question remains, what would you have done differently? Because every civilization is only one bad harvest away from collapse.